Good morning. Welcome, everyone. As you're getting settled, we're just going to take a couple minutes for a little over 100 of our colleagues to sign in and get settled. Good morning. As everyone's getting logged in and settled, I'd like to just express a welcome to today's webinar. I'm Dina Jensen, the Director of the Center for Nonprofit Leadership, and we're going to get started in just a moment. Good morning. Just waiting a couple minutes while we get everyone loaded into the Zoom. And I'm going to go ahead and invite, if you'd like, to introduce yourself in the chat box with your organizational affiliation. You'll check out the regional leaders that we have on today's Zoom meeting. A special thanks to Doug Green for being with us this morning. And we'll just give it a minute or two here.
I want to say hi to all of the
Yes.
familiar names, but it's moving so quickly. I'm not going to take the chance of missing anyone, but just know that I am so happy to see so many familiar names.
I also have a childhood flashback of Romper Room. And,
Yes.
Yes. So good morning, everyone. Really happy to be spending this time together this morning. I'm Dina Jensen, the Director of the Center for Nonprofit Leadership at California Lutheran University, and it is a delight to welcome you to today's virtual webinar. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes while our colleagues get loaded. A quick reminder that today's session will be bilingual thanks to the Language Justice Network at Just Communities and our colleagues who will introduce just a moment, but a special thanks to Lena and Simone for joining us. We'll just give it one more minute and we'll go ahead and get started, Doug. Good morning, colleagues. We're just going to give it about 30 more seconds and we'll go ahead and get started. Lena, if you'd like to join me, I think we should go ahead and get going.
Good morning, buenos días. This is a bilingual message and will be repeated in English. Hola, somos Lena y Simone, somos miembros de la Red de Justicia Lingüística de Comunidades Justas y hoy vamos a interpretar este taller para ustedes entre inglés y español. Un ambiente bilingüe exitoso depende de todos, no solamente de las intérpretes, así que ustedes pueden ayudar teniendo en cuenta algunos puntos. Por favor, hablen claramente para asegurar que se les puede escuchar. Hablen a un ritmo moderado y tengan cuidado de no hablar demasiado rápido para que podamos alcanzar a interpretar todo. No queremos que se pierdan de nada. Solamente debe hablar una persona a la vez para que no tengamos que decidir a quién interpretar. Hablen en el idioma que se sientan más cómodos. Pedimos que las personas bilingües no cambien de un idioma al otro debido a las limitaciones de esta tecnología con la que estamos trabajando. En un momento, la anfitriona activará la función de interpretación y en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla podrá seleccionar el idioma en el que desea escuchar la presentación, ya sea inglés o español. Esto le permitirá escuchar cuando los oradores hablen en ambos idiomas, pero en el idioma de su preferencia. Si está teniendo algún problema con su conexión, mande un mensaje por el chat al anfitrión para resolver el problema. Gracias.
Hello, we are Lena and Simone, and we are members of the Just Communities Language Justice Network. We will be providing interpretation between English and Spanish for today's webinar. A successful virtual environment depends on all of us, not just the interpreters. You can help by keeping a few things in mind. Speak clearly to ensure we can hear you. Speak at a moderate pace. Please be careful not to speak too fast, especially if you are reading, so we can keep up. We don't want to miss anything. Only one person should speak at a time, so we don't have to choose who to interpret for. Speak in whichever language you feel most comfortable. We ask that bilingual folks do not switch between languages due to the limitations of the technology we are working with. In a moment, the host will turn on the interpretation feature, and at the bottom right corner of your screen, you'll be able to select the language you want to hear the presentation in, English or Spanish. This will allow you to hear when speakers of both languages talk, but in the language of your preference. If you are having any trouble with the interpretation feature, send a message to the host through the chat so the issue can be resolved. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much, colleagues, and thank you for joining us today for our virtual seminar on strategic partnerships, collaborative practices to sustain impact, with the one and only Doug Green. Doug is a longtime community leader, a friend, a mentor and colleague in our region, and is a senior consultant at La Piana Consulting, a prestigious firm that's serving with a national practice with deep bench strength in strategy, planning, strategic restructuring, and change management. A treasure in our work at the Center for Nonprofit Leadership, Doug is phenomenal at engaging organizations of many missions, budget sizes, and complexities, engaging all of us in a way that is fun, content-rich, and engaging. And in this climate, we can't and mustn't go it alone. The needs of individuals in families and communities rely on us as social sector leaders and nonprofit organizations to work together, to leverage our strengths for the greatest good. That is a crux of today's session, exploring what various partnership models and case studies look like, the practices of partnership, and how we may all deploy a different mindset in getting our missions met working collectively. This session is part of our COVID-19 webinar series, sponsored in part by the First Five Ventura County and the Ventura County Community Foundation. Next slide, Doug.
Yes, of course. Next slide. I'm on it.
We also have some additional virtual learning opportunities in the weeks ahead, and we welcome you to visit our website to check out upcoming sessions. Next slide. You can also follow us on the following social media channels. And next slide, Doug. And these efforts also depend on individual donors just like you. If you'd like to make a personal contribution in support of these virtual offerings and keeping them low and no cost, a gift of any size is welcome. And I'll put an easy link in the chat box in just a moment for your convenience. Today's session is bilingual and interpretation partners from Just Communities Language Justice Network. Our ability to do so is made possible by the McCune Foundation, and for that we are truly grateful. And finally, in the true spirit of today's session, I recognize our collaborative partnership with capacity building partners across our region. In the early weeks of COVID-19, each of us was working diligently in service to our communities and quickly recognized the power of our collective action, leveraging our strengths and our networks in service to our social sector colleagues. The center began convening our colleagues on a weekly basis to coordinate our efforts. Thank you to our fellow co-conveners of today's session, the Nonprofit Resource Network of Santa Barbara, the Ventura County Community Foundation, the Santa Barbara Foundation, the Fund for Santa Barbara, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, Santa Barbara and Ventura Counties Chapter, Just Communities, Leading from Within, and Visionality. Just a final couple of words, housekeeping. Today's session will be recorded and made available after the session along with our slides. We kindly invite you to pose your questions throughout today's session using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Those of you who post your questions in the chat box have a higher likelihood that your question will get lost through our session, so please use that Q&A function. And lastly, a message about language justice. We want to acknowledge that best practices are to have the materials in both English and Spanish, in addition to the interpretation that we're providing today. We're working on this for future webinars so that we can ensure that these spaces are truly inclusive and multilingual. As we work to increase our capacity, we are grateful to start using Zoom interpretation feature on this webinar with our help from Just Communities. So Doug, without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you, Dina. I am so excited to be here, although I do want to say this, that you are dealing with a presenter today who is a digital immigrant, to say the least. So the whole idea of presenting this type of webinar with this complexity of technology behind it is a little unsettling to me. And I just want to say, I could not possibly have done this work without the help of the entire team behind us, the interpreters, Madison and Amia at La Piana Consulting, and of course, Jenny Lynn and Dina from the Center for Nonprofit Leadership. Just want to say thank you to all of you. Just a little bit of word about my own background or journey with all of this. I think of partnership, large and small, as a way of life in the nonprofit sector, that actually we can't do our work without collaborating with others. And yet, there are certain things that make some partnerships really cook and others not so much. So today we're really going to explore that, and we're going to look at a full range of partnerships, from the casual to the enmeshed. So we're going to look at collaboration through full integration of two different organizations. So buckle your seatbelts. It's going to be quite a ride. So this is, I'm sure, something that everyone has seen, this African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think this is sort of at the heart of so much of our collaboration and partnership in our sector, this realization that we actually can only do so much on our own. I remember 15 years ago almost, the book Forces for Good came out. And one of the big light bulbs that went on for me was that the real impact that we create with our organization is often in the relationships we have with other organizations, not just sticking to our own operations and programs. So think about this as a way of really leveraging your mission impact. And want to say that throughout this presentation on partnerships, that in my mind, the most important thing to keep in mind is your mission. None of us got into this business with the idea of, oh, I want to create an organization. Now, what should the mission be? It was quite the opposite. We came to the sector saying, I have a burning desire to change the world and to make the world better for families or for children or for pets or for the environment. I'm going to plant my flag in that cause, and the organizational form and the partnerships that we developed after that really followed a deep sense of mission and commitment, and that when we talk about creating intentional partnerships and more formal relationships with our partners, the mission focus should be, in my mind, at the fore or at the center. So partnership expands our impact. Collaboration enhances the capacity of participating organizations for mutual benefit and to achieve a common purpose. So I'm interested to know what your experience has been with that. So I assume that it's varied, but we're going to find out here in just a second. I want to ask Madison to help us with our first of three polling questions. When you think about your past partnership experience with other organizations, how would you characterize the outcomes that were achieved? So select one of those and hit submit, and we'll do a quick check of the group. So it looks as if, looking at the poll results, that most of us have had a super positive impact, mission impact outcome from being involved in partnerships. Some have had less impact than others. And then some say that partnerships have not helped that much, that they've had no influence on mission impact. And it really raises the question, for me, why are you involved in those partnerships? And, you know, sometimes they're perhaps funder-driven relationships or politically driven relationships. But I think today what we want to focus on is the things that we can do to consciously shape partnerships that that expand mission impact, that actually have that significant impact on our mission and our reach. So this is the map of the known collaboration universe. This is something that La Piana developed a number of years ago. And by the way, let me stop here and talk to you a little bit about our firm. Years and years and years ago, this was back in the 1980s, I worked on merging failed nonprofit financial institutions with healthy ones. I cut my teeth on doing just multiple mergers of failing financial institutions during the financial crisis of the 1980s. And so I had a kind of an interest in mergers and partnerships, and I got a notice from La Piana Consulting around the turn of the century, back in like 2000, 2001, that they were giving a workshop on partnerships, strategic restructuring, and mergers, the whole range of possible options for creating stronger partnerships. And it was something that I was naturally interested in, and so I jumped on it, and I took the week-long, actually in San Diego. Then I found out that this is the way that La Piana was really founded. 3 large California foundations came to La Piana and asked our firm to do a study of what makes partnerships work and what makes them fail, and to actually do a sector study on this. And the result was a book on partnerships and strategic restructuring that we've published, and we have both the book and the workbook to guide you. We can provide that resource later. But this was my reintroduction at the time, around 2000. And then I joined the firm 5 years ago and have gotten re-involved in assisting organizations in thinking about partnership development with La Piana. So this is sort of our, the collaborative map that you see in front of us is sort of our description of greater and greater levels of integration. And the way this kind of works is that the outside ring really represents collaboration, collaborative opportunities, and they range from just collaborative learning or coordinated action through joint advocacy and providing networking opportunities. I want to talk a little bit more about my experience with that in a moment. And then inside the purple ring is really about more formal alliances. So joint programming, fiscal sponsorship, administrative consolidation, joint earned income efforts. And so these are partnerships that are really guided by a more formal agreement. There's not been a restructuring of any of the organizations involved, but there has been a formalizing of partnership. So I want to today talk a little bit about what leads to success in those types of deeper alliances. And then the final form of collaboration is actually some form of integration, developing a joint venture corporation. The example that I'll provide today is a management services organization, parent subsidiary structures, or full-on mergers or acquisitions by nonprofit organizations. So we're going to talk about the full range today. I want to talk a little bit about that collaborative structure on the outside of the concentric rings, the gray ring. And I don't know about you, but this is, in my past, been sort of a way of life for me. When I think about working through the United Way on the Children's Oral Health Collaborative, that was an example of a cross-sector involvement that had many, many different players working on providing access to oral health for children. Another example for me is the Oxnard Alliance for Community Strength. That was an effort that my partner Barbara Marquez O'Neill and I were involved in years ago, around violence prevention for the city of Oxnard. It again involved collaboration that crossed sectors. We had public sector folks involved, private sector folks involved, and of course a lot of nonprofit folks. And the effort was really multi-pronged. We did some advocacy work together to create some policy change. We did a lot of shared learning. We put on a couple of conferences that I think really changed the conversation around family strengthening and community strengthening. That was another example. And then finally, one that's very near and dear to my heart is the Partnership for Safe Families and Communities. That organization, I think, started out as a collaborative network that met monthly to learn from each other, to do joint advocacy, etc. And actually finally came together and created a separate organization to support their work. And sometimes that's the case, that organizations start out, or partnerships start out as a loose collaboration, and then they move into some kind of formal structure. So again, I think if everyone wouldn't mind, like just use the chat box and just list one collaboration that you are currently involved in. I love it. So everything from one participant in a collaboration with the one that Karen expressed about working with a partner in Uganda, and then Lauren mentioned Help Me Grow, which is multi-participant. Organizations have a broad range of experience, including working with affiliates of perhaps a national organization that you're a part of, working with across national lines, with other organizations that serve a particular group that you share, children or seniors, etc. So I think that I can safely say we all have a tremendous amount of experience with this type of collaboration, and that everything that we talk about from here on out in terms of success factors in building successful partnerships will relate as much, in my mind, to less formal collaborations as they do to more formal collaborations, particularly when we talk about challenges and success factors. So I want to talk a little bit about alliances that are more formal. And in doing that, I just kind of go through the list really quickly with you. One is, administrative consolidation, where one of the partners takes on or consolidates the administrative functions for others. Another one is fiscal sponsorship. You see this quite a bit where organizations like Community Partners in LA or Tides in San Francisco actually provide all of the back office support. And in fact, they are the 501c3 organization. And if you apply for grants, they're the grantee. There are all kinds of examples of successful nonprofit organizations either starting out or continuing to be fiscally sponsored. Joint programming often involves some kind of a formal agreement between the organizations, and particularly if you're getting involved in a joint earned income venture, that you would definitely want to have a clear agreement between the parties about how that would work. Affinity groups are often bound by a particular set of standards, agreements. I remember years ago, I was involved in working with sort of the upstream version of the Partnership for Safe Families and Communities. There was a statewide group called the, I'm not even sure if they're still around, but the California Network of Family Strengthening Networks. And that group, when it got together, it was a collection of folks who do collaboration on family strengthening at the local level. The first thing that they did was put in place standards and agreements across the organization. And then finally, coalitions, consortia, and associations that you want to create a more formal structure with and get members to actually buy into rules of the road that guides a more formal alliance. So I wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking about a couple of examples of these deeper alliances. The first one is really a joint programming example. And this is not just two organizations. This is extrapolated from an entire initiative to encourage collaboration between domestic violence programs and FQHCs, health providers. So I'll give you just sort of the overview of this. The opportunity really was presented when the Affordable Care Act was passed, that really elevated domestic violence prevention as a key component of family and community health. And so across the state of California, multiple partners were of healthcare and domestic partner, domestic violence prevention partners were brought together to consider how they can create a more formalized arrangement between them. And really, in terms of the effort, the real success factors were early building of trust and rapport that would allow them to experiment and learn together. And so this is like point number one for me, that often it's great to be involved in a partnership conversation, particularly when you're going to do something formal like shared programming or even shared advocacy, that you have some familiarity, trust, and rapport among the partners. So the results are that there were some real significant changes made to the program model on both sides. So at the FQHCs, there was this introduction of domestic violence screening and referrals that were offered there. And then the other thing was that they hosted support groups around domestic violence at the healthcare provider site. So the domestic partner the domestic violence partner, came in and actually offered to do support groups within the FQHC. And then on the other side, at the domestic violence prevention partners site, the healthcare provider offered health education. And so the result at the end of the day was better patient outcomes, really driven by increased access to care and services. So everybody, it was a win-win situation. I think much of the credit for this goes to both sides really seeing this from a mission impact level. How can we increase the health of our constituents by partnering? The next case study I want to share is two very specific partners who did parent education. So they also created a more formal agreement around joint programming, a little bit more involved than the previous example of the FQHC and the domestic violence prevention provider. So the challenge here was that both of these organizations were combined serving about 2,000 parents through their individual programs. And they were both located at the same hospital and operating in separate spheres. Like they actually didn't have that much experience with each other. So they had this limited program reach. There were a bunch of other hospitals in the region that they weren't serving, and they were increasingly competing for a limited amount of funding to support parent education. The interesting thing is that they were really doing very different things. Every Person Influences Children, EPIC, was really focused on more of a skills building parent education model. And Baker Victory Services, I think I'm getting this right, by the way. For you young people in the room, I'll just say this will happen to you. So what the Baker was really focused on more of a medical model. To provide parents with an understanding about child development and the importance of early care and wellness checks and that sort of thing. So these were two very different approaches, one more of a psychosocial model, a skills building model, and the other really a health-based model, a medical model. And then, in bringing these two together, it was really about the time that they had together because they didn't know each other that well, and the investment in planning, really developing that trust bond between them to do the work together. And the result was pretty amazing. They brought together at the end of the planning period, which was took some time, and I'm talking, more than a year rather than a couple of weeks, but bringing people together over time, they created a model that blended the parenting skills model and the medical model to create this much more powerful approach to parenting. They were able to then expand to 4 regional hospitals, expand their reach from 2,000 to 8,000, and actually increase their funding base. So I know that this is often a concern when you get involved in joint programming is, won't the funders see this as, oh, now we only have to fund one group? That is not what they experienced. They experienced the fact that funders were really super supportive of this powerful approach to parent ed. The next example really doesn't stem at the program level, but at the administrative level. And so really driven by sort of a sense that at the program level, there was some really solid programming that was being done by these Chattanooga museums. But at the end of the day, one of the partners was super strong administratively and the others not as much. So I'll just tell you that they were experiencing budget deficits, a couple of them, really inefficient and cumbersome back office functions. The Creative Discovery Museum was a fairly recent invention. It grew out of a sort of an urban renewal project in Chattanooga. They built this Creative Discovery Museum on the banks of the Tennessee River, close to the Hunter and the Tennessee Aquarium, with the idea that this would make a perfect complement to the others. But what they didn't recognize was the amount of work that it would create, that it would take to create a really robust and effective back office. The Hunter Museum of American Art was an older institution that had been around for a number of years, and really had kind of grown inwardly focused and much less effective, and had a lot of outdated administrative systems in terms of their databases and their technology. It was fairly old school. The sort of the hero in this scenario was the Tennessee Aquarium, which had this robust back office. They really had their act together in terms of HR, IT, finance, etc., and they were able to show to the others that they could manage the back office. You know, the way this got started was that Creative Discovery Museum went to the Tennessee Aquarium and said, how about we merge? And the Tennessee Aquarium said, well, not so much. That's not going to work for us. You've got more issues than we can deal with right now, and we've got our own to deal with. But instead, really, eventually this idea of some type of administrative consolidation within the Tennessee Aquarium came to the fore. And through, I think this was, it can be said, the real success factors here were a thorough self-assessment and partner assessment. So really knowing your own strengths and what you do well. Both the Creative Discovery Museum and the Hunter had awesome programming. It was really in the administration that they lacked. And in looking at the Tennessee Aquarium, they saw the complementary organizational strength. So being able to pool their funds really allowed them to think about hiring top of class people for back office. So it did involve some pooling of funds, and here's the result. They consolidated all of their administration within the aquarium, and the impact of it was a $4 million savings for the sort of the three institutions as a whole, an increase in annual fundraising. I think the report I heard just a couple of years after this was completed was a $1 million bump in annual fundraising. And then because they were consolidating their efforts, they were able to really think through these things. And then they did a $20 million joint capital campaign. They were located in this kind of park alongside the river. So they actually improved all of their plants and the park along the river so that it became this incredible community gathering point. And the collaboration of the museums really drew a lot of private and public support for what they were doing to essentially work cooperatively to bring the best of culture to Chattanooga. So I want to talk a little bit about strategic restructuring, and this involves some creative development of alternative organizational forms, or you know, at the most integrated, a merger or acquisition. But one of the things that sometimes happens is that groups come together and they create a joint venture corporation. Again, I mentioned that sometimes this is a management services organization, and I'm going to share an example of that. A management services organization is simply an organization that is an independent entity providing back office support to a number of individual nonprofit organizations. Another possible form of restructuring is some type of parent subsidiary structure. Often this is driven by either concerns of about autonomy, or you know, not wanting to be completely involved in a merger, or it can be driven by financial concerns, fear that a certain funding stream would go away because of a triggering termination clause. This is a common kind of issue, and one reason that if you are involved in strategic restructuring and it comes to the point of, yes, we're ready to do this, it's just a question of working out the details, that you actually look at all of the contracts on both sides, including the funding agreements, and engage funders in a conversation about what you're up to and how it will create a deeper mission impact, and get them on board with the idea early on, or not. And if they're not willing, you know, sometimes the parent subsidiary structure is a way to continue to have two different 501c3 organizations for funders to place their money with. I am going to stop just for a minute and see, Dina, have we gotten any kind of questions on where we are so far before I talk about this last example?
So none from our audience, Doug, but I had a question for you about about how do you get participants in a discussion like this to shift their focus away from survival to the longer point of view of greater mission impact?
Yeah, I think of this as a kind of a little bit of a carrot and a stick approach, if you will. The first one is that I like to, from the very beginning, root every conversation about partnership in the mission conversation. How does this drive our mission forward? What is, you know, how is this possible to do more together than we could do alone, and to continue to kind of drive that point forward. But also, I think through the sort of self-assessment process that we're going to talk about in a minute, you can actually demonstrate the places where your organization is strong, but also where it can be assisted by a partner, either at the program level or at the administration level, that people begin to see, oh, this is a way for us to actually get stronger and still be able to fulfill our mission. As a matter of fact, I think one of the benefits of the Chattanooga administrative consolidation is that for CDM and the Hunter, it took all of that administrative stuff off their plate and allowed them to refocus on programs and what they do best, which is culture. So I think it's a combination of an honest self-assessment where you're thinking about not only your strengths, but areas that you aren't so strong in, and also rooting every conversation in mission impact.
Fantastic. I have a question that just came in, and it's with the example of an administrative consolidation. I'm so impressed by the fundraising success. Can you give more information as to why and how?
Well, I think part of it is context, that in Chattanooga, you had a city administration that was depending on the museums to be a focal point of community. And so there was a certain amount of energy behind them. So that's part of it. Another part of it, though, is the willingness to co-invest in fundraising opportunities. So at the aquarium, they were able to pool resources and hire top of class fundraising professionals to drive those efforts forward. And so being able to pool resources and leverage the impact. And then finally, in the area of fundraising, and then finally, I really think it is about messaging throughout the process. So being able to have a great story to tell to funders about why the organization as brought together is stronger than the parts. So providing great examples of how this will allow organizations to improve their programming, or how it will allow them to be more efficient, and actually show that to the funders and engage them early and often on conversations about the benefits of partnership and restructuring.
And then finally, Doug, before you go forward, can you just give us an example maybe of a really strategically controlled communications plan around even the inception of some of these conversations, and then also the shadow side, maybe a cautionary tale about the cat getting out of the bag before the core messaging had been developed?
I don't have any recent experiences with the cat getting out of the bag, but I'll tell you a funny story later or in a minute. But, the general gist is that when people get involved in a conversation about a more formal tie with another organization or group of organizations, that two things happen at the outset. One is that the board of each of the organizations passes a resolution to say we're going to pursue good faith negotiations to deepen our relationship, and that they, number two, come together and develop a joint statement that they'll say no matter what is asked early on. So while they're sort of banging out the details before they've reached a decision about either go or no go, or beyond that, how it's going to be structured, sort of where it is on the continuum of partnership, that you have a statement that says something like, yes, we are considering how to deepen our partnership in order to expand our ability to serve the community, and we're involved in those conversations, and we will let you know as that develops. So want to get out ahead of it and have that, but let me just be clear, that is to be held in reserve in case somebody sends an email that's intended for one recipient and it goes to another, and it gets out and people find out about it. There's an immediate ability to react, and then later on sort of working out in concentric rings from the closest stakeholders. I think the board needs to be kept involved through the process, and then from then funders and other close allies brought in a second round of, this is what our intentions are, this is what we're going ahead with, we want your support, and then after that, the general public.
And Doug, would you kind of speak to, you know, formal policy documents like confidentiality agreements, non-disclosures, and the use of memorandum of understanding in terms of the sequencing of communication?
Yeah, I mean, I have used non-disclosure agreements at times, but my general attitude about non-disclosure agreements is that they're only as valuable as the commitment of the key players. In other words, all the paper in the world is not going to prevent the person who wants to create sabotage from doing it. And so I'm much more focused on creating sort of the trust bond among the participants than I am in worrying about an NDA. But I will say it comes up, and we have those and use them when people are cautious and they want to create that belt and suspenders approach.
Fantastic. And I have one more. You decide if we should do it now, or I can also hold it. Our collaboration is forming a separate entity with fiscal sponsorship so that we can focus on programming. We need to determine who owns any assets we purchase with funds we raise. We are being told that the entity itself cannot own the equipment, but if a partner owns it, what if they leave the collaboration with that equipment?
Super good point. You know, I think I'll just answer this, and then
Okay.
if there's a follow-up question, I can handle that later in the Q&A. But I think it's about having a clear agreement. The first thing I'd say is that looking at that kind of an arrangement where the shared entity can't hold property, if that is important to you, that they should hold property, then you really need to think about whether that's the appropriate corporate form for the separate entity. Number one. But if you do decide to go that route, what I would suggest is that the agreement that you reach, the formal written memorandum of understanding or contract among the players, specifically speaks to how assets are contributed, acquired, and disposed of in the event that the partnership dissolves or one party leaves, so that anything that's been contributed for the public good or for the good of the collaborative stays within the collaborative no matter what. And so I'm not a lawyer, but I do know a few, and I would immediately call a lawyer friend to ask for their help in reviewing or drafting an airtight agreement among the parties.
Would you extend that also to intellectual products that are created in the collaborative environment?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Terrific. Thanks, Doug.
I was going to say that years ago, I was in Little Rock with putting together a merger of two financial institutions, and it was Thursday night before the Friday. It was supposed to be the closing of one, like descending on this large multi-state financial institution with examiners to close them down and reopen them with another. And the word got out, and the news channels all called at the same time. And so me and two other friends raced to the three, this was back in the day when there were only 3 media outlets, and we each took a position at the top of the show to introduce the idea that, yes, we're here, we're the federal government, and we're here to help. Anyway, very stressful, very crazy. That's my only out of the bag experience. Thanks for letting me share that. So I want to talk about an actual strategic restructuring example. This is the development of a separate management services organization called Mac Commonwealth. And it grew out of a collaboration of family services organization in Minneapolis. The challenges that the group was having was really maintaining high quality staff and supervision of the administrative functions. So everyone, or not everyone, but a majority of the organizations involved in this collaborative were talking about how difficult it was to create the high-level back office that would support programs and operations. A couple of the players, it was a broad group, but a couple of the players were the Family and Children's Services Organization and the Pillsbury United Communities, and other members came together. They had this existing collaborative. They'd been working together. They had the trust, the open communication already, and as a first step along the way, they created a joint venture agreement, sort of a looser structure, more along the lines of an alliance. And then later, they created a subsidiary membership organization with each of the founding organizations holding a membership share in the subsidiary and sitting on its governing board, that they were able to create this efficient back office operation to do a broad range of HR, finance, IT, etc. For the collaborative. And so the result was really increased operational efficiency. They created a cross-organizational financial platform. They had 20 professionals with more than 2 centuries of combined experience. So we're talking, depth of experience in finance, HR, and IT that really sort of elevated the ability of all of these organizations to manage the back office. I'm going to look at this. Dina, was that a question that came in?
It is. So we have a question about, in your experience, how do the collaboratives allocate G&A expense, especially if one is larger than another?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the key points of negotiation, and one of the, we'll talk a little bit about sort of doing your financial due diligence in restructuring and coming up with a formula for actually allocating expense across organizations of different sizes. So my initial response to that is the way I would do it is to do it by asset size or asset complexity. But I think that it's done on a case-by-case basis where if you were involved in a conversation about strategic restructuring, part of that would involve sending your finance people off to a separate room to sort of bring back to the group a straw model for how you would work through this allocation of admin expenses.
Thanks, Doug.
So I want to talk about the key success factors in any kind of partnership development And I start with mission focus. I think this is the place where we really need to remind ourselves that you can ask a lot of partners in terms of flexibility, but asking them to abandon their central purpose for being is a bridge too far. You cannot do anything without honoring the mission focus of each of the partners. And a very kind of related success factor is that of being flexible in pursuing the mission. So we've all been involved in groups that are like, nope, we've always done it this way, we will always do it this way, and we're not changing. And that sort of thing is the death of partnership. So staying true to your mission, but having some flexibility in how you realize it is a key thing. Not in an immediate crisis. This is a tall order in the current environment, I know, that, but many partnership has failed because one of the partners is unable to make payroll, or involved in a lawsuit, or having a reputational crisis. So we don't want to discount the need to be sort of clear of all of that. A basic lack of divisiveness among the players. So some amount of goodwill or willingness to build goodwill is key. Clarity around desired outcomes. I'm going to talk a minute about the sort of the formal process for negotiations, and one of the early pieces of that is doing an assessment of your own desired outcomes and being clear about that before you ever get involved in a conversation about your partnership with another. And then, of course, it really helps to have positive relations with the potential partners that you're talking with. Either a track record with them, shared values with them, some experiences in perhaps joint advocacy or joint programming, or perhaps you've been on a conference committee together, that sort of thing. So this is what I wanted to do now. I wanted to ask you guys to just take a minute to reflect on a current partner that you have or that you're considering. Which of the success factors is most present in this relationship? Just get you to reflect on that for a minute and weigh in and submit.
And I'm also just going to take this moment to encourage you, if you have questions at any point, just go ahead and add them to the question and answer feature on Zoom.
Mission focused. I'm delighted to see that ranked the top, because I think there's a certain thing about being mission focused that creates both opportunity and boundaries. So with a proper focus on mission and mission related impact, you have basically planted a flag in the sand that is both attractive to others who share your mission focus, and also somewhat repellent to those who don't. I was intrigued to find that no one stated that that the most present is not an immediate crisis or a lack of divisiveness. So it just means that we're all feeling optimistic and friendly in my mind. But I do see where people really thought that having those positive relations was a second piece. So next thing I want to talk about is roadblocks, and these are the most common concerns or challenges that arise in a partnership conversation. Autonomy concerns, turf, people wanting to make sure that they continue to have this independent, autonomous action. So anything that might limit that is a concern for autonomy. A lack of trust. So whether it's from some kind of past experience or from a reputation or just a lack of time together, sometimes it's about lack of trust. Self-interest. I want to say that self-interest is not a bad thing. Everyone is coming to partnership with a certain level of self-interest. There's no shame in that. There's no reason to apologize for your being interested in your particular program, your position, your relationship with the funder, etc. That's all quite normal and something that kind of needs to be considered in really developing a stronger partnership. And then finally, I would say just a little bit about culture. We like to say culture eats strategy for breakfast. This idea that having really significantly different cultures in your organizations can provide a roadblock to deeper collaboration or partnership. So last of our polls, I'm wondering if you think about a partnership that you'd like to develop or deepen, what is your biggest concern? Which of these represents your biggest concern? So sort of two leading ideas, organizational culture. I was involved in merger negotiations for two Central Coast-based organizations a few years ago, and they really had a different set of core values. That ended up not being the real deal killer, but it was still a big roadblock to greater partnership between the two. But giving up autonomy or control over programs or operations is a close second in terms of deepening partnership. So I want to talk a little bit about the restructuring process. And before I dive into this, I want to say that this conversation is sort of ultimately anchored at one end in the idea of the higher forms of integration, development of a parent subsidiary, or some kind of a consolidated structure that could be like a merger or something like that. The reason I'm presenting sort of the highest form of integration at some times during my talk is that I feel like all of the principles of this process are applicable across the board. And we often say that when we get into a partnership conversation, we want to identify what the sort of the most integrated form of partnership that anyone at the table can imagine, and drive toward that, yet be satisfied that the process itself is going to deepen relationship, deepen understanding of your own organization, and ultimately bring the partners closer together, whether we achieve some desired or initially imagined form of integration. The benefits of this process are great, whether or not you engage in developing a new organization or merge or what have you. So really, it's about a series of steps that begins with a thorough self-assessment process and partner assessment process, and then a decision point to engage in good faith negotiations, then negotiations culminating in some kind of an agreement, and then getting involved in implementation. That involves sort of a legal, I mentioned, getting an attorney to review the integration document, and then developing a plan for integration of the partners so that, at the ultimate, if it's a true integrated partnership, that there's a way to resolve some of the differences among the partners. Dina, should I stop there? Are there questions that are pressing, or shall I press on?
No, I do have a couple of questions, Doug, and I think it goes back to the poll we just participated in. And the first one is, any tips or strategies that you might have to overcome or mitigate organizational culture differences? How do you cherry pick or adopt the best of each other's organizational cultures?
I'm going to say three quick things, and then as things fall out of my brain later, I'll add them to this. But the first thing is to really, when you're doing your partner assessment and you're identifying a partner, to really look at things like their mission, their values, their vision, and how those align with your own. So looking for artifacts that give you an indication of how, what their organization is like. The second thing is to really look at, through the assessment process, you're going to bring to light sort of organizational components, and early on sort of sharing those. Within our organization, this is how we make decisions, etc. And then finally, when it comes to the integration phase, that's all kind of in preparation for deeper partnership. Once you've decided to either create an entity together or merge or acquire another organization, the job at that point is to think of this as co-owned, as something that is no longer yours or mine, it's ours. And to begin to create, as part of that process, some early wins to show how you can move forward together as one united partnership, or in the case of a new organization, one organization.
Thanks, Doug. I've got a couple more if we can.
Sure.
Just fantastic. How do you How do you correct or move forward after a merger that was not handled well from a staff, community, and donor standpoint?
I don't have any of those in my quiver. But I would just say it depends upon how it was not handled well. And so, what we try to do with the partnership development that we're involved in is to create a really thoughtful process, which I'm about to describe, that would take those pieces away. But I can imagine that, that part of it is about the process. Part of it is about communicating well with stakeholders, having a really solid communication plan that, again, builds outward from the central players to the funding community and other key partners to the general public, that's really well thought out, and that everyone across the system is on message with the key advantages of the partnership. And at the end of the day, I guess my feeling is if you do a public faceplant, although I try to avoid these at all costs, as you can imagine, that part of it is about transparency and willingness, if it's a real issue, to cop to it and to put your attention around correcting it.
Thanks, Doug.
You said two.
So I think I have another one that's a comment. So we'll go ahead and take that one. And it's in Spanish, and so I need a little bit of time to translate it.
Shall I give you that moment?
No, it's okay. You go ahead and go forward, and I'll circle back.
So the first thing is really about an assessment process, and we're looking at everything from soup to nuts in terms of this. What are the organizational strengths that you bring to the table? This is key for me. I think it's important to be both reality-based and strength-based. I think I've said that, and this is an important concept for me, that we have to be clear about what our strengths are. We have to know those areas of operations where we're both strong and where we could use some help. Those areas of outreach and engagement of the community where we're strong and where we need some help. Our funding model, what's that? Our administration, strong or needs improvement. Our culture, how are decisions made in the organization? How are we communicating within the organization? Is it a top-down model of decision-making and communication, or is it more of a collaborative shared responsibility? And finally, I think getting to the culture piece, really assessing your organization's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and understanding where you're coming from there, and perhaps some of your non-negotiables around that. One thing I would say about this self-assessment process is that a key part of this is having this done collectively on each side by each partner. So partners have a chance to sit individually first before sort of getting together and talking about what their motivations are. And the motivations are another key part of assessment. And the reason that we look at motivation, strengths, organizational strengths and weaknesses, and organizational culture is that often within your own organization there's not a shared understanding of those things. And so going through a thorough self-assessment process is a key feature in just coming to the partnership table with a clear and consistent understanding of where your organization is, what you do well, and what your motivations are for seeking a partner. in doing the partner assessment, you know, it's very different if you know the partner. You may have access to, easy access to their programs and to some extent their people. You can go online with any partner and look at their 990 and be clear about any kind of financial issues at first glance, although that's problematic, as you know, that we all have experience with outdated and inaccurate reporting. But I think being clear as you can going into a partnership negotiation about what the strengths and challenges of your partner are, and what their focus is in terms of their mission and their values. If you don't have a particular set of partners in mind and you're thinking about, like, how do we do that? I think that you could think about this in about 3 different ways. One is folks that are doing exactly what you're doing, sort of direct competitors, and whether there is duplication of effort there that, if eliminated, could be incredibly attractive to funders and really take some stress off of the competition for funding. So the next sort of band out from there is organizations that do complementary things, either at the program level or the administration level. And so the Chattanooga Museums was an example of sort of complementarity of organizations. And then the third one is really about organizations that are in your same space or your same field who are competing with you for funding generally. They may not be doing the same programs, but they have programs that are operating in your same space and that are attractive to the same funders, and you're competing with them, and there may be an opportunity there to either identify organizations that you wouldn't want to partner with because it would represent too much unhealthy competition in the air, or that you would because the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. So partner assessment is a key part of this. The only thing I will say about that is, and here's the slide on self-assessment: motivators, what you're hoping to achieve, critical issues that you want to uncover. And they could be anything from governance, like how you would govern the partnership, to how you would fund the partnership, to who would, what the structure for leadership in the partnership is, sort of any red flags for you, and then your sort of financial assessment, where are you currently? And this includes things like how consistent are our funding streams? What's our cash situation or runway of unrestricted assets? These kind of things come out in that self-assessment process and are key to, again, having shared understanding across your organization, but also engaging in dialogue with others.
Doug, before you move on, we're being asked to maybe slow the pace of our speaking down just a tiny bit. And I have a question for you about both sides' existing contracts and obligations. When does that conversation come into play? Is it during the due diligence phase?
Yes, it's later in the due diligence phase that those things get shared. I think that one thing that I would say is that you generally get to the point where you've decided on doing some kind of formal integration or formal partnership or creation of something new through the strategic restructuring process before you would look at contracts. So it looks good. Sort of a final hurdle that we have to get through is to look at the financial side and the ramifications. And then when we're thinking, and by the way, I will slow down. Usually people are encouraging me to speak faster. So this is an adjustment for me. I often find that I think and speak more slowly than others, but I'll bring it down. I understand interpretation adds a level of complexity to that. You know, in doing the partner assessment, you know, considering things like the level of trust between you and the other partners involved, past experience, their usable skills and assets. You know, sometimes partners are attracted by one partner might be super great at earned income. They've got they've got a product or a service that they're regularly selling under contract, and it's quite helpful for them, but they've got no capacity for fundraising in the philanthropic sphere. And so this can often, these kind of, you know, looking at a partner and seeing skills and assets that they have that we don't, can be a compelling thing. For mergers, I did something in LA a couple of years ago where one organization had all this land but no cash, and this other organization needed office space and facilities and had tons of cash to spend, but were spending it all on rent. And so the two came together in part to take advantage of the real estate holdings of one and the cash of the other. Any big red flags or cautions or challenges should be noted. And then, you know, the mission and the program compatibility. You can't really see merging an animal shelter with, I don't know, an advocacy for children. I'm not sure that those would work together. So anyway, making sure that the two programs or more are at least complementary. And then, of course, we'll do an initial kind of look at 990, and then we'll do a little deeper dive on partner financial condition later in the process. So again, this is sort of driving towards some kind of a fully integrated organization, either the creation of a new organization, a merger, or an acquisition. Typically what happens is that the partners' boards of directors would individually meet, would go through the, after they've gone through the full assessment process, their own self-assessment and the partner assessment process, they would pass a resolution to engage in good faith negotiations with another partner. And they would then send a group of representatives to a joint negotiations committee. And this generally always includes the executive director and 3 or 4 or 5 board members that would join that negotiations committee. And their real task is to negotiate issues and then oversee the due diligence process. The way that I see this kind of opening up is with really an exploration of the issues that were surfaced during the self-assessment process. So I tend to come prepared to that first meeting with a slide that says, here's what you said about key issues that we need to work on. Are there any others? And begin from there. And then after you go through the negotiations process, a decision is reached that is approved by each of the board of directors. The negotiations committee has no power whatsoever. They're tasked with going through the process of negotiating the issues and submitting recommendations to their respective boards of directors who are really in the driver's seat. It's a board decision, any kind of formal restructuring process. And then we move into sort of beginning implementation and cultural integration, a little bit more detail on some of that. I want to make sure that we talk about, generally, these are the big headers of negotiations, either in a merger or the creation of some kind of third entity that's providing services to the partnership. Who's going to lead sort of the, if you're creating a shared governance structure, how that's established. You know, oftentimes you'll see some kind of an approach that blends the existing boards or sends representatives from each organization. But that has to be worked out. How the finances are going to be approached, and the assets. Recently, in a merger that I've been involved with up in the Bay Area, there was a big concern that the community had raised funds for a community center, and they didn't want that to be owned by anybody but the community. And so that asset was removed from the conversation and was put into a separate structure in order to allow the organizations to integrate. So very complicated, but essentially key conversations about the assets, the liabilities, the funding streams of both organizations. Another example is in sustainable agriculture. I did something a couple of years ago on these two international sustainable ags corps, and one of them had sort of a great, robust consulting arm around sustainable ag, and the other one, a certification process. And so they had very different funding models, and they brought those to the table, and the agreement around the table was that these were complementary financial models or funding models. HR, who leads, who doesn't? What do you do with capital? I mentioned that case of the community center. What do the programs look like, and how will the communications for both the merger or the integration work? Often what I find is that when you're involved in this and you have a team of 8 or 10 individuals working together to drive toward an agreement, that what will happen is that you'll have, it'll be like typically a 4-month process. Can take longer, can be shorter, but the average is 4 months of meetings that last a couple, 3 hours. And so a lot can get lost between meetings. And so what typically I will do is, if governance is up, I'll ask for a couple of board members to, perhaps the board chairs, to go off and to come back with a straw model for how governance might be handled, so that we don't lose time brainstorming in the session. We've got something to react to. Same thing with programming and org structure, etc. So that sort of speeds the process along. So again, you get to some kind of place where everyone is like, yeah, this really actually looks like it might have legs. Let's take a deeper look under the hood. We want to look at the finances. And generally the way this looks is that each of the organizations will prepare a report on their their finances. When I'm involved, I like to provide a common structure for that report and actually sort of ask the hard questions and set the parameters, usually looking back 3 or 4 years to give a little sense of the track record of each organization. And then before it gets shared with a partner, I ask the organization represented to provide any context, color, commentary on the numbers, because often there's a story behind a particular set of numbers or a trend in the organization. Doing the HR comparison, are there positions that are overlapping that might need to be either consolidated or where you can see 2 program directors on either side, or 3 if in the case of a larger organization, and it's a shared programming endeavor, or it is a merger, that they want to come together and sort of sort through the impact on the people involved in the organization and being real transparent about that. And then looking at some kind of a projection for a combined budget and a look at cost savings. And then finally, this gets to the question that came up earlier. During this process, really looking at the restrictions that are represented by donor funds that have strings attached, and looking at whether you have some overlap in your donor base. Generally speaking, this is not a big problem, but it can be a significant problem if your common funder has a policy of only funding one organization in your space every year. So you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot. My idea is that you surface these, you compare notes, and then you have at this point, a little outreach to your funders and your major donors to say, we're considering a more formal partnership. This is not going to require less resources of us. It's going to probably initially require additional resources. We hope that you'll at least maintain the level of support that you provided to us individually as we get together. And typically funders are very receptive to that conversation. After all, it was funders that really drove early on in the latter part of the 90s and early 2000s, really were driving this conversation about strategic partnerships. And then, during this financial exploration phase, it's good to look at a broad range of documents. And one of the advantages of having a third party help with the negotiations is that that person can be your vetter. And so you're not turning over a bunch of organizational documents that might be sensitive to you, to somebody who you've not yet decided formally to engage in a deeper restructuring with. So all the organizational documents, to make sure that they've got a 501c3 determination letter, that they're incorporated in the state of California, their 990s, although those are available, but typically I find that the most recent ones you have to get from the partner. I like to look at the recent audit reports for others that have an audit. Again, looking at personnel, insurance records, and a list of capital assets, including any real estate owned and their related debt. So if they own a bunch of property, you want to have a sense of what the mortgages are on those. So when it comes to, so you pass that stage, everybody goes, yeah, we're putting together a sound partnership or a sound organization. We're ready to move on. You have both boards independently vote on implementing the new structure. You finalize an agreement. And oh, by the way, finalizing the agreement. One thing I neglected to say when I was talking about the negotiations process is that what we do, and I think is a really good practice, is that we keep a set of rolling minutes that essentially record or memorialize the agreements that the partners have reached during the negotiations phase, so that when it comes time to putting an agreement together or a plan of merger or some kind of a formal agreement for partnership, that you've actually got everything that you need to turn over to an attorney and to have them draft those agreements. And then there is, if it is a merger or an acquisition or the creation of a new organization, you're going to have to file either incorporating documents or other documents with the government to stay in good partnership with them. So then, following all of that, now you've got to think about integration. And culture is at the center of this because it is, and I'll come right back to that in a second, but it's sort of like the controlling feature. Again, culture eats strategy and implementation for breakfast. But essentially, there has to be an integration of the board. And so I think one of the things that really helps is that once you've decided to create an integrated form is, again, you begin to talk in we language and abandon us and them. Again, I mentioned that often it's really helpful if you're creating a third organization or doing a merger, that you have representation of the partner organizations on the governing board. You might think about a structure where 4 to 6 individuals come from one, 4 to 6 individuals come from the other partner, and then you select a group of perhaps 4 to 6 new board members. You got to consider integration of management. So a key issue here is who is the and this is negotiated in the process, but who is the organization's leader? Sometimes it's super obvious. In fact, that's more the case. I'm working on a merger of 2 LA arts organizations right now, where there is a person who clearly wants to go back into programming and really has no interest in the administrative side, and one who has her administrative act completely together. And so, but those kind of things have to be worked out and integrated. And even with as a clear understanding, there are issues of how they merge their leadership styles, their management styles, etc. Staff, bringing staff together to create one organization. Programming. And by the way, when it comes to programming, systems, marketing, communications, and management, again, I think the best idea is to think about how you can work with small groups to generate recommendations for how to achieve integration, and then bring those back to top leadership for consideration, vetting, feedback before going forward. But I think working in small cross-partner teams to consider issues of integration is an ideal approach. And finally, just kind of at the risk of talking about this too much, culture is can be such a deal killer. And again, a lot of this can be mitigated by the process of assessment and negotiation. But at the end of the day, this is the integration of two partners' cultures in either a new organization or a merged organization or a new sub. And you want to be clear about, first of all, what the needs of each of the partners are, what the values of the organizations coming to the table are, just to have those in mind, and then to immediately start developing cultural artifacts for the new organization, a new tradition, a new story, a new name, a way of separating what was from what is, so that people begin again to think about we rather than us and them. So just a few more points on culture, just to be super intentional, like to pretend that culture is going to address itself without having some folks pay attention to it, and to consciously craft a new culture is a possible mistake. Maintaining two-way communication, making sure that everyone is being able to express both excitement as well as their concerns. Again, everyone comes to this integration process with their own self-interest, and that's not, that should never be shameful. People should be able to talk about that. And the next piece is to really, have those early wins and celebrate successes, including the decision to create something new together. Starting with that and then building from that, making sure that you take time out to really notice every time you do something well together. Pay attention to dispute resolution and make that, jump on that quickly. And then make the communications and decision-making processes really explicit. So if you're going from having a model of top-down to wanting to integrate a more collaborative decision-making process, that needs to be stated, and probably stated in a few different ways, so that people understand the new, the shared model going forward. And then just to be able to monitor the culture, both sort of internally, what's going on inside the organization, but also how it's impacting our other relationships in the community. So a couple of pitfalls, organizations don't usually, our mergers don't usually fail because leaders can't integrate systems. They fail because people tend to hold on to individual cultures and identity. So here are just a few lessons learned, and we're almost at the end here. So, so the first thing is to be prepared. This is going to take some time, and you should be prepared for some people not sticking with it. There are going to be, perhaps, this doesn't always happen, but it happens often enough to mention it, that there'll be people at the board level and at the staff level who, for whom the argument that this is a better way to achieve our mission impact is just not going to hold water. They're going to want to hang on to what was. So people may leave. There are both costs and benefits. So immediately there are some transaction costs. You're going to have, hopefully, if you reach agreement, you're going to have some costs of paying outside counsel to help draft something. If you want to have an independent third-party help, that's a cost. Usually, both of these things can be, I would say with the having an independent party assist with negotiations, frequently that's something that a third-party funder will support. And when it comes to the legal work, often you can get away with finding a pro bono a legal partner who will do that. But still, there are costs and there are integration costs associated with this. So, and then finally, make a plan for reaching out to donors, key partners, and membership early on in the integration process. You want to get them behind you. Ongoing, you know, we want to think about building change management into the culture with the recognition that change is difficult for folks, that people generally don't love change, that it creates both excitement but also anxiety, and sometimes anxiety more in some than others. And then to be able to talk openly about the needed changes and why they're needed. So just a final look, that managing strategic restructuring is partly about trusting, respectful relationships with partners that share a purpose. It's partly about process, that you attend to assessment, negotiations, and thoughtful implementation. And finally, it's about a focus on desired results. Enhancing or expanding mission impact, strengthening programs, creating a legally sound and financially viable alternative going forward. So I am at the end of my slides. I'm wondering if we have a question or two in the 4 minutes that were remaining.
Yes, we'll be quick about this, Doug, because I would like to get to all three. We're going to swim back upstream to earlier examples of more collaborative partnerships versus restructuring. And the first one is, I think, both a comment and a question. In your experience, or what would your advice be? Is it better to partner with someone else, or is it better to work harder to get ahead on your own? It seems like it's always good to have partnerships with other organizations, like less formal partnerships with other organizations, but sometimes partnerships are not always positive because of that mismatch in mission and objective. So just kind of thoughts on when to go it alone, when to reach out.
Go together. So I'm just going to say that two quick things. One is a lot of the partnership mismatch and the pain can really be mitigated through early assessment of your needs and theirs. I love this idea of creating a partner screen when you're thinking through who would make a good partner for you, to get board and staff together to say, these are the 5, 6, 8 criteria for our ideal partner. And that creates a little bit of a boundary around that. With regard to which is better, going it alone or going together, I'm always going to side on the idea of going collaboratively if you can do so and maintain your sanity and your mission focus, because I think we all got into this game realizing that it's about community and mission and public good rather than private gain.
Terrific. I also have a question about partnerships between small budget and large budget. How can you best navigate equal power dynamics in these partnerships? I've seen partnerships that have suffered because of who is holding more money and seen it the most valuable contribution in the partnership.
Yeah, a couple of quick things. One is to acknowledge the uneven power dynamics from the get-go, to just make it clear that this is what we're dealing with. We've got a large organization and a small organization. So And so to put that on the table, the second thing is to really be explicit about your decision-making criteria early on, to set really good ground rules for the negotiations process and the ongoing management of the organization, so that you have a plan for offsetting the uneven impact. And then finally, I would say, an important conversation is around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how that conversation more broadly can inform the specifics of how to integrate a partner that doesn't come with your assets or income.
So I have a scenario to get you to reflect on here. A successful partnership between two partners of a few years finds itself bumping up against capacity limitations to grow the campaign. Both parties are clear they want to add a third party to the mix to amplify the success. Assuming cultural compatibility and mission alignment, what particular advice or precautions would you recommend on introducing that new partner into the mix?
A couple quick points, and I may think of a third while I'm talking. The first one is to develop that partner screen. You want to have a clear agreement among the current partners about the ideal third, and to have a set of criteria for thinking through them and making sure, like, it's not a checklist, do they fill all these boxes, but do they fill enough of these criteria for us to proceed? And the second thing is being completely transparent with the new partner about both your motivation for involving them and any concerns that you have, so that you can begin to work those out. And I think finally, it's about having a clear agreement in place.
Fantastic. And then Doug, also further upstream in the continuum is just to reflect on partnering to promote programs collectively. Best practices, success stories that you might have had.
So, again, I think the first, it sounds weird, but I think the first step in being able to, I hear this as a messaging question, but I'm going to answer it differently than a messaging question. I'm going to say that this is about a program development model, that what needs to happen is that the players that are involved in developing a collaborative program model are actually engaged with each other in a program development program model, so that by the end of the planning period, they are so connected to each other, they don't see themselves as being from separate organizations. Then the next thing is, I think, working with that group, the program level group, to identify the strengths that they bring together, the strengths of the common program, in order to message that in the most powerful way. That would be my recommendation, to root the development of the message points and the communications of the communication of them in the program staff.
Thanks, Doug. And then the last question we have is from Natalia, and it's, are there any best practices to protect intellectual property? In most cases, it's a database of donors working in multiple partnerships. It's a bit confusing who owns the database that results from partnership activities.
I just think this is a key problem to be resolved in the negotiation phase, that we want to make sure that we're clear about, I can't speak to the general question because I don't know the specifics, but I would say that generally speaking, putting the issue on the table, being transparent about why it's an issue, coming up with a clear agreement, and then empowering the parties to enforce it. And to, I think particularly with databases, there are ways to put safeguards around poaching.
Okay, well, Doug, thank you so much for the generosity of your time and your wisdom, your insight, and your contribution in this body of work. I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up now in the interest of time, knowing that this is big topic, but please, any closing remarks?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm so happy to be back in Ventura County virtually, and I wish I could see your faces because this has been so strange talking to my own computer screen. Uh, but know that I'm with you, and that I really feel like having this conversation about partnerships is intended to just put extra arrows in your quiver for achieving your mission.
Well, on that note, Doug, thank you. Thank you to your colleagues, Madison and Namia, for making this all happen. To my colleague, Jenny Lynn, for being a fantastic colleague. And also to our friends and colleagues at Just Communities today, to Lena and Simone for interpreting and on the fly translating questions from Spanish to English. I'm going to say thank you to everyone for making time for today's session and giving careful consideration to the best partnerships and collaboration that we can possibly foster in service to our region. In a day or two, you'll receive a recording of today's session and along with Doug's slides. I would also encourage you in the chat box, if there are topics that you would like to see us explore further, we would welcome that feedback. And I wish you a very peaceful rest of your day and week ahead. Take good care of each other and yourselves. Thanks so much for today.
Thank you, Dina, for hosting us.
Absolutely. Anytime, Doug.